I've just been interested in the medieval in general. Okay. Why? I guess the background is I've written about and researched so-called informal housing or self-built housing in self-built cities as sites of political and legal experimentation. And the medieval city was always that. And it always sort of occurred to me that there's so much moralizing in politics around self-built urbanism, but were it allowed to, if we're nurtured and treated as kind of still forming, it would be able to instantiate and manifest in slow motion new political projects and would acquire an aesthetic weight eventually that would be representative of that political experiment. And so you'd have beautiful architecture and potentially interesting social and political arrangements. And that's very much, if you look at the literature on medieval cities, there's a clear coherence between the substance and aesthetic of architectural expression as an expression of a collective consciousness and of kind of social well-being, right? So one has to think of the architecture and urbanism of medieval city as an expression, as understood at the time as an expression of its society's health, potential political power, but also of the kind of social order that would allow for such creative and committed expression, right? The working assumption for the perspective of a medieval is that people are like the society is functioning relatively well if people can express themselves. So the kind of post-enlightenment myth of the medieval, if you look at Chartres, is that how do you get this much level of detail? Is that you have slaves, like a feudal arrangement that you can force people to do it. But the medieval historiography and a lot of interesting revisionist writing on the medieval, particularly anarchist literature, looks at the primary sources that show quite the opposite, right? So that a certain level of articulation of the architectural it was explicitly produced as a propagandistic evidence to the town nearby or the city nearby or the rival nearby of the magnificence and virtue of social organization, right? And that's tied not only to kind of like symbolic well-being, but to a very, very specific political project. So just as, for example, medieval Italian city-states would have competed over their bell towers or their kind of church or cathedral, or just the general. It's interesting because the individual building becomes much less important in the medieval history, right? So it becomes about.
Well, certainly we don't know who the architects are.
We don't know who the architects are. And the city is seen as quite literally as an expression of a collective consciousness, right?
And it's
so
over
it's in
time.
aggregate, and when the wonderful medieval historian Chiara describes the medieval perception entering into a city as a kind of temporal scansion, and the city is self-consciously built to reflect this temporal scansion, right? So and this ties in with the political projects. So one has to look at a lot of the medieval, but in particular, kind of 11th to 10th to 13th century medieval northern and central Italy. My interest is as laboratories for communal political experimentation. So just as every town is competing over a different style, a different look of a bell tower, different forms of ornamental expression, in a kind of cooperative competition, a kind of each one makes everyone better. You also have an equivalent experimentation in political systems, right? So all these extremely complicated and varied forms of nested council structures to try to ensure forms of representation that don't align with any particular vested interest, right? Where the kind of old noble families are seen as a counterweight, they're integrated into this. But the extremely elaborate, a council of 10 elects a council of 2, which elects 4 councils of 4, which then collectively pick one council of 20, where there's a certain amount of representatives from the big families, from the various guilds, from the various parishes, are forms of allotment and sorting over many, many layers to create different forms of like symbolic political justice. I mean, in Siena, to be a council member, the council member rotated on I think, a monthly basis. And I think almost everyone, at least every male, would have had to have participated. So people underestimate the radical political and self-aware and reflexive political experimentalism of the communal era.
It's so interesting that a lot of the kind of perception of the Middle Ages is rooted in, let's say, the reductive nature of medieval painting.
Oh, right.
So, yeah. And so we see the medieval painting and we say, well, that's the level of articulation or aesthetic understanding. But what you're describing is a much higher level of...
Well, so first of all, the Renaissance has to be understood as the tail end of 300 years of political experimentation and artisanal experimentation in the deep intergenerational entrenchment of the guild traditions that allowed for certain refinements of production, but that then gets co-opted by the signoria, the kind of ducal families that then harness all this experimentation, transforming consular rule into symbolic incorporation into their hegemony as a political project of confrontation with their neighbors. So you know, you have a kind of rationalization that happens in the Renaissance, which includes perspective, and lots of people have written about that. But I'm particularly interested in, I mean, a lot of things change, right? From the 15th century through to the Enlightenment. But in particular, I think one of the main reference points for me is, and this is building on the work of Jacques Le Goff, the great French medieval École des Annales historian of medieval Europe, who talks about you know, what the imagination meant from the perspective of a medieval, and how that becomes the mechanism through which we can relate to the artifact as well as the political. So you have this kind of rupture that happens beginning in the Renaissance and ultimately in the Enlightenment with Descartes, where we understand reality is distinct from the imagination, right? There's the real and there's the unreal, and the imagination is the unreal. So Le Goff teaches us that in the medieval imagination, the imaginative is the threshold between the self and an exterior reality. And so, whether it's painting or architecture or other forms of expression, these objects resonate anthropologically with the record of imaginative and mnemotechnical or memory devices as interfaces between the self and a reality that's being constructed. Right? They're the imaginative threshold that exists between a reality and the self. And in constructing that imaginative threshold, we are rendering something real. This relates to the philosophy of Giambattista Vico and his dictum, verum ipsum factum, which means the truth is a fact, or the facts make truth and truth make facts. So there's a kind of fundamental kind of counter-enlightenment position where there's a reflexivity and self-awareness around the nature of making as part of self-definition around what is a cultural truth. And philosophically, that would explain the connection between architectural experimentation and political experimentation, right, as a manifestation. I mean, you'd have planning laws in medieval Florence or Siena. Kropotkin tells us in Mutual Aid in 2 chapters on the medieval city. You have planning laws that say a building can only be made if it's made with love, right? Which is, it sounds kind of cute, but that was the actual code. I mean, you have to assume, to read that seriously as a historian, you have to enter the world where the word make it has to be made with love is mutually intelligible and agreed prima facie, right? That wouldn't intrinsically be the case now. I mean, it would be the case if I told you that for food. And if I showed you 2 plates of food, one that was made with, and I said one was made with love and one was not, I think kind of universally everyone would be able to identify which one it was. And then if I told you, well, why? Well, you'd say, okay, well, whoever made it took their time, but then also the ingredients are good, because what's the condition of possibility for good ingredients? Farming that's done well and cared for and not wasteful, using kind of pesticides and highly mechanized processes, but like someone actually taking their time, and then supply chains that are thoughtful, that brought those good tomatoes to you, and then not only the cook who is doing it carefully, but the intergenerational knowledge that has cultivated that chef's or cook's capacity to make that meal. So it's that plate of food that I tell you is made with love as opposed to the one that isn't. If one actually thinks about that, encodes like a four-dimensional depth of all the conditions of possibility, intergenerational and geographical and temporal, that allowed for that quality. Now one can then relate to the medieval visitor of Siena, who would be able to read the city with the same understanding and awareness that someone today might read the difference between a plate of food that was made with love and one wasn't. And then you could understand how the planning code would allow for that. So this isn't just abstract historical thinking for me. This is like, I think some fundamental principles about how we deal with the limits of the Enlightenment imagination around the rational, the self, the individual, property rights, and how we get back to things that we already know, that when one builds in the city today, one is not just building for themselves, but for those around them. And the system understands the freedom to build as in spite of other people through, for example, nuisance laws, which are the kind of primary determinant of what you can build. But no one understands freedom as something that exists through the other, right? With the imaginative construction of the built environment as the threshold through which that happens, right? So this then links to my interest in property rights, which comes out of my work on informality, right? So what would happen if you had a legal platform for the opposite of nuisance law, which is all about the prohibition of annoyance onto others, but that rewarded, for example, the contribution to a collective good that constructing something would entail. And that could be aesthetic or it could be very practical. And there are very, very practical ways you could resolve that. For example, reductions in council tax, if you can demonstrate.
Can I just, on Gian Battista Vicar, he also has that principle of history being an alternating line that goes up and down. And if we put that, if on that line we put that medieval time of a much more, the higher level of collective consciousness, let's say, if I understand correctly, that's how you describe it. Where are we then? Where are we now on that Gian Battista Vicar's line? And
I don't want to.
And where are we going?
Who's
in a sense?
we? I don't know who's
or like
we.
Society. Or
Society
like
is varied. I mean, what's clear is that we're at the kind of is that the promise of modernity is I think reaching its conclusion, right? Like that we're on the crossroads of something new, and that hopefully, I think now is the time to sort of to decide that the cusp of something new is as a plural condition of plural goods, that there isn't one location that is the future, and this kind of projection onto the world that then is a source of so much violence, right? This kind of creation of a kind of ideological invention that that is hegemonic and colonial and violent and racist. So I don't know. I can't predict the future. The world is in an awful place right now, but this looks like the dying throes of a now very naked emperor, right? Very naked lie that is the promise of the future being in a particular place. I mean, I when I teach like modernity, and I think my kind of quite reasonable belief that project is at its conclusion. One need only look at sort of representations of the future and how they're recycled from the past, right? So like Blade Runner is still the kind of iconography of future science fiction. and Blade Runner aesthetic is from 84 or something, which is the year I was born.
Yeah, as long
And
as
actually, original Blade
also,
Runner takes place in 2020 something, which is kind of now. And then the new Blade Runner just borrows the aesthetic from the 80s. So there's a kind of redux.
And all of the kind of space travel science fiction just uses the same language of the 2001 or earlier.
Yeah, and then one must realize that in that sense we're much less modern than someone living in the fin de siècle, in really anywhere, but in particular in the kind of capitals of modernity, who would have perceived futurity as like a relentless onslaught of tomorrow, right? The kind of Turner train painting going through the smoke of time, right? You would perceive, you would have a sense of this exhilarating and terrifying, sublime, falling into the unknown, full of promise and all that is solid melting into air, right? All that one knows about an embedded nature of social and economic life evaporating, of being anonymous for the first time, of being able to associate in cities as a stranger on your own terms for the first time, of being able to self-represent as being maybe to a degree the person that you would like to be, being aspirational in your physical expression, of wandering through an arcade and picking the clothes that allowed you to represent yourself as someone that you were told you weren't growing up, of encountering difference in cities. I mean, like the kind of exhilaration, overwhelming exhilaration. I mean, it's well documented and written about in the whole history of modernity. But I think that, and I think that certain places might be experiencing that. China, I don't know, but
modernity is a collective project, isn't it? So it is a project that is trying to articulate a collective spirit by putting everyone in the same maybe typology or...
Yeah, I mean, through the tenets of individualism, capitalism, with all of its consequent sort of legal principles, offers the possibility of a unified framework to resolve difference, but actually the premise is rigged, right? Like that's the phenomenon and all of post-colonial theory tells us, is that it promises the capacity for equivalence, but actually precludes that possibility a priori, right? So one is not considered human. I mean, eugenics follow, kind of inevitably follow.
What drew you to Cairo and Egypt and the Middle East?
Okay. So when I was an undergrad at Berkeley in like 2002 and 6, 7, it was kind of a time that's reminiscent of right now, right? As when the Iraq War broke out, or the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the fabricated lie that led to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a colonial war. And I was very upset and very quickly realized that this was wrong and being in Berkeley sort of was politicized and wanted to do something about it. So I was involved as an activist. And but then sort of also realized that I had to sort of have a more personal commitment, and the fundamental problem of understanding, of cultural understanding, an early intuition around Orientalism, right? So the portrayal of Islam as evil, or of Arabs as somehow subhuman or something like this, that was somehow always inside the media discourse.
Or enemy, at least.
Enemy, but somehow intrinsically incapable of, it presented as intrinsically incapable of reason. That was very clear in the noise made around all of this. And so, I've always loved languages and studied and spoken many languages, and so I started studying Arabic. Because this is how one understands, and also how one can translate. And to be an advocate of rehumanization, one has to be able to speak. Or speak with, and to understand, and to try to interpret, and to help those who do not understand have a sense of legitimacy, or to bring legitimacy to my effort to help other people understand. So yeah, so I started studying Arabic, and I went to Damascus for a bit and studied there. And then I was going to do a PhD on Iraqi refugees in Damascus as a continuation of my commitment to this farce and tragedy, and to some kind of restorative, in my humble way, some kind of to write about it in some way as a kind of form of restorative justice. And then, and also as a way, and also I kind of fell in love with the beauty of art and culture and everything around it in Syria and in Iraqi culture in Syria, and then started the PhD, and then the kind of Arab Spring broke out, and in Syria it very quickly descended into a war, and it was too dangerous. So in the first year of my PhD, I had to shift. I was not allowed to go to Syria to work on Iraqis. And of course now Iraqis were returning from Syria to Iraq. Syria had become more dangerous, so the project didn't even make sense. The history had changed too fast. So then I picked a project, and so then I was just looking around to sort of save my PhD proposal. Then I found in the news, kind of local Egyptian news, and a very interesting story that got to the heart of some of the big false dichotomies within urban studies. Okay, about particularly cities of the South, right? And that being the kind of so-called formal-informal divide, which as an undergrad, my mentor, Professor Nanya Roy, had always challenged. So, what is this dichotomy? Is informality related to kind of logic? How do illegal formal buildings get constructed, but legal informal buildings get demolished legally, right? So what's happening there? And then I found this case study of a gated community, an affordable gated community in the suburbs of Cairo, exurbs of Cairo, that was being squatted by evicted slum dwellers who were frustrated or angry that an affordable housing scheme was being privately built on land given for free by the government and then sold to a kind of new middle class as affordable, and not to those who'd been recently suffered a rock slide and been then later evicted and promised housing by the state. So you had what I intuited at the time as a kind of genuine political experiment, right? You had three forms of legal debasement happening. You had a revolution in Egypt, so the state was compromised, the rule of law was highly compromised. You had a highly contentious land transfer from the state to a private company in the name of affordable housing that excluded the urban poor. And then you also had the condition in much of the world, but in Egypt in particular, where private gated compounds, which this was, exist in a kind of extra legal space, kind of certainly in terms of social mores, but also in terms of actual law, for example, sale and consumption of alcohol, but also people's relationship to clothes, to habit, to shifts, as if you were in Sharm el Sheikh or a tourist space. So you have this case. I found myself with this really fascinating case study of a place where I intuited and later found through an ethnography that lasted almost 2 years of living in the site and spending time with people who were stealing and squatting homes, as well as people who had bought homes, and seeing the conversation, where you had an active conversation about what counts as legitimate urbanism, what counts as legitimate. So all parties were modifying these homes. The people buying homes were turning their homes into kind of luxury villas. The people squatting were turning their homes into semi-commercial spaces to sustain life. Of course, they became dependent on each other because the people refurbishing their homes had to hire the squatters, who were often builders and masons, to refurbish their homes. And they also needed to have their cars repaired, to be able to buy staples without driving for half an hour out of the desert. So an interdependence emerged, and a conversation around a kind of organic conversation emerged around an organic intellectual conversation around what constitutes legitimate urbanism, what is actually informal. Is someone modifying their house and turning it into the front garden into a shop that looks maybe ramshackle because it's using inexpensive materials? Is that informal? Or are people building kind of luxury trimmings on and combining two houses, which is totally against the covenants, informal? Right, so that conversation, which happens in urban studies, was happening already with residents. And then furthermore, how does one, what counts as ownership? If the precondition from ownership beyond the law or an absence of the law is a moral position, right? Which involves financial transaction, but also involves what you do with that property, right? Even in the most solid sort of common law or even civil law tradition, use, legitimate use is central to ownership. And that was highly contested. So the whole ethnography became a case study, not only in these tropes of formal and informal becoming fundamentally corroded within the internal conversation of residents, and residents having to reconstruct the frameworks for legitimacy in urbanism, but actually started questioning what the law is and what property is, and what the sort of moral foundations are for property. And so you had so
it sounds like a live experiment akin to what you're talking about when you talk about medieval.
Yeah, I mean, if you could bracket the overall arch of my work, it's the city, or the kind of dense accumulation of people and construction, as sites of political experimentation, and the conditions which allow those political experiments to flourish. Right? Because again, this goes back to the modernity question, right? We need to actually nurture and cultivate experiments to see what works. And furthermore, and truly in the medieval fashion, a kind of ecosystem of plural and competitively cooperative experiments about what works for people, rather than this kind of normative horizon of the future as the unifying framework, which inevitably amounts to a kind of an extraction of a hinterland, right, for that future. It's intrinsically a manipulative ideology. So how one, at a macro scale, creates the intellectual framework for plural goods existing in a competitive cooperative relation, perhaps much like the communal system in the Lombard League. I mean, I don't want to romanticize this, okay? But and then at the micro scale, how even very practically, so from a ideological position, the kind of moral frameworks that allow people to think this, to incorporate forms of creating the truth, political truth, in the built environment through architecture, but then also how the value of architectural intervention as nurturing political experimentation, and the value of political experimentation itself. So how cities are machines for political futures, better political futures, has been lost, and how we sort of retain that, right? I mean, people think of civic pride is still a narrative or a kind of framing that is resonant, even if it's been kind of neutered and has a kind of formal, it's kind of formalist meaning, it's kind of symbolic meaning. It's lost its substantive meaning, which would have been a more medieval one, which is civic pride around the conditions of possibility that allowed for beauty. But it still resonates. So, you know, how does one reconstitute the notion of civic pride as a policy narrative, or as a popular cultural position in valuing interesting architecture? All our colleagues here, but in a deeper substantive sense, that civic pride has a greater value than just symbolically witnessing a city's visual greatness, but the good architecture intrinsically must be an expression of the conditions of possibility which allowed for it, which are the construction of which are the political experiments which construct potentially societal health. It's kind of complicated, but I'm trying to weave together.
I wonder if you see any hopeful examples of that in the present day London.
I mean, all the time. I think that the most interesting thing about architecture to me, in the world we live in now, the speed of change and technological interest, is that I think it's more important than ever. And this is not just propaganda. I mean, my whole career studying architecture and teaching and writing about it is people endlessly telling you why architecture is important, and that obviously comes from a position of weakness, right? Like, it really matters. If it matters, you don't have to say it. I think it really matters because everyone obviously knows it matters in the way that everyone knows that food matters. And that there's quality and there's low quality, and every person has an intrinsic understanding. And as an aside, I'm most interested in popular critiques of architecture, taxi drivers calling buildings funny things, and how one understands a non-elitist reading of good architecture, and how one aligns those things, as would have been the case in the medieval. as the ultimate ecosystem for good. But where was I?
London today?
Oh yeah. So the key thing I think is, well, the commodification of the city and the financialization of the city doesn't allow for the speed, the slowness that's intrinsic to both political experimentation and good architectural creation and their alignment.
For sure.
But that's so to be constructively critical, like we can see that that's the problem, but deconstruct.
Yeah.
So that offers an opportunity, right? The slowness of architecture is the same speed as culture, right? Cultural, broadly, when I mean culture, I mean it kind of as a broad cultural consensus, the emergence of new social facts, the transference of factum into verum and back, to be Vishian about it, to be Vico about it. Or yeah, I mean, we could get more specific into the more contemporary versions of that thinking, but how, you know, aesthetics moves into logic, moves into utility, moves into ethics, and back to aesthetics. There's a kind of, this is Benedetto Croce, but offers an opportunity, which is that culture has a particular kind of consensus-based culture, or shifts of culture, meaning shifts of the common sense, shifts in what is considered legitimate, take time. They're intergenerational, right? Like, an architecture intrinsically, through its very nature, will always be physical and takes time, right? And so this is maybe wishful thinking, but I hope not. I think that if one can, my intuition is that there's an alignment in timeline, as everything moves faster, as everything becomes some dumb AI slop, you also have some benefits, which is some of the bullshit jobs of the world will go away, because those are the first.
Yeah. But architecture will always take time.
Those are the biggest impediment to good.
Yeah.
So
architecture will always take time. I mean, inevitably, the speed of construction is faster than it ever has been, but it still takes 10 years to produce a large building.
It has to, by definition, take time. And the time of architecture is the time of cultural change. The speed of architecture is the speed of cultural change. And so, as a broad principle, I'm not saying an individual building will change culture, but I'm saying if one appreciates, values slowness, just like in food, slow food, whatever, then one aligns the cultural capacity of architecture to instantiate and express political experimentation. But capital will not allow it for now. So we have to reevaluate it through other ways.
That's such an interesting perspective, because I think we live under this illusion that culture is moving too fast and that architecture is never in tune with culture, but perhaps it is perfectly in tune. I think the impression is, when you see just how many collections Jonathan Anderson has put out since he became the creative director of Dior, 3 months ago, it feels. There's been 5 collections since. You feel that culture is moving so fast, and that we are here scraping to potentially, start a project or rethink something.
I mean, any movement requires a deep fermentation within a community that is usually proximate or located. And if you talk about subcultures, I mean, this is kind of an obvious point, and I don't totally believe it, but I think it still matters, right? I don't think you need a yes or no position. You can have very rapid cultural, which usually is consumerist, the speed of consumer cycles. But if you want to have deep cultural, if you want to re-relate the cultural production to an anthropological understanding of culture, meaning the kind of common sense value positions that organize our society, if you want to align the two cultures, then it has to be rooted or embedded, and it has to happen organically in the time that people shift their points of view, right? No one sort of changes their view overnight, or rarely, or fundamentally, their value positions, right? Or sort of becomes open to a different value framing of the good. So, yeah, this is a very philosophical level of conversation, but I think it's not an answer. It's just an opportunity for positioning craft and making, and which rests on a solid philosophical foundation, which is the relationship between making and truth, and cultural experimentation, and cultural value, and culture as art, and culture as the collective values that underpin our common sense orientations.
There's also an impression that transparency has been a cultural value of the maybe late 20th century and into the 21st. So much architecture that's built and so many students justify their designs, especially when they have a political angle, through this notion or idea of transparency. You make the Reichstag, the roof of the Reichstag. You can look in and suddenly the political system is actually transparent. And whether it's an illusion of transparency or whether transparency with, let's say, the Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office where the fourth wall breaks and Trump and Vance attack Zelensky in front of a global audience. How do you think of that?
Yeah, I think I'm against, one of my big inspirations is Karl Polanyi, and he makes this big distinction between formalist reading of society, or formalist economics and culture, and a substantive culture, right? These kind of metaphors of transparency, I think, are banal and vulgar and counterproductive, and service capital, right? So when all this language of flexibility, transparency, frictionlessness is all about speeding up the removal of money from your pocket, right? Like that's just obviously what it codes for, but in the guise of democratic. Right, so this is the slipperiness of metaphors. Like once you start thinking in this kind of this formalist understanding, this kind of metaphorical or symbolic postmodern understanding of value, then it immediately lends itself to cooptation and manipulation, which is ultimately pretty simple. It's just how frictionless is my wallet? How transparent is my wallet? How flexible is my ability to spend. At the same time, like anything good comes from limits. It's very obvious, from friction, from negotiating the inflexible, from opacity and interpretation. This goes back to the medieval as a threshold between the self and the real, right? So I'm all for a full transparency of the Epstein files. Obviously, and transparency of wages, so that we know if women are being paid less than men. But I'm obviously not for transparency of conversations between a shrink and their patient, or even between a student and their teacher when we're developing a project because it's not ready yet, right? So there's the cultivation of a project. There's time, and slowness is important. So I just don't buy the it's transparency ergo good, because it's already it's a kind of dumb reduction of a platitude of liberal values. So political transparency, yes, but then transferring it to the market, this constant liberal trick, right? But then furthermore, it's even more pernicious when it's mobilized by technologically empowered digital corporatist and now oligopolistic capital for extraction. So it's, if a word is that slippery, then it's maybe not worth using.
But in the context of a school, it sounds like an easy trick to unlock a project,
right?
And
I think it speaks
it's
more
so
to the inability of people to think through materials. So you just default to glass or open plans, and then also the mechanization of design imagining through CAD, where there is no thickness to the line, right? So The more you zoom, the line doesn't change. So there's like a fundamental insensitivity to materiality. And if you go back to history, and for the purposes of this conversation, we're only drawing on European history, but I think this would be a global position, is that anything good comes through the accident. And the accident requires a thickness to the line, because that's the margin of error. So the expression rule of thumb comes from builders, saying that, more or less a thumb off the line is good enough, but at some point they have to correct when the thing doesn't fit, and in that correction, something maybe interesting happens. There's like the
informality just amplifies that.
Yeah, so it's a kind of it's like a constant expression of like the collective adjustment. But again, I don't want to romanticize it, but because it's a function of precarity, of extreme precarity, and of just urgency. Okay, so there's the accident that comes out of urgency and precarity, which should not be romanticized, even though huge amounts of ingenuity can come out of that. But in a socially embedded and balanced condition, the embracing of the accident becomes the highest form of usually artistic expression. I mean, which again doesn't just happen in a romantic, magical way. To be canonical as heck. Like Alberti would write the description of a building and maybe sketch it for the interpretation by various forms of guild trades, masons and carpenters, to interpret, to fill in the gap. And that you have this like you have intersubjective and interrelational interpretation, and that only exists because of the trust one has for a guild and the reputational value of the quality of production.
But then finally, Alberti is the beginning of the collapse.
And it's also the beginning of the collapse, yeah,
of the medieval principles of collective.
Yeah. Well, it's also the beginning of the art. Yeah, I mean, you would have. Yeah. I mean, because it's also the beginning of the kind of the architect in a way.
Yeah.
So
who gives instructions?
Who gives instructions? But then Aldo Rossi draws on this, and this is in a book by a person who's become a friend at the University of Genova, Vittorio Pizzigoni, in his new book, Architettura come fatto storico, I think. It's going to be translated soon. But there's this quote from Aldo Rossi, which is maybe apocryphal, but he's writing about builders of Bergamo. Bergamo in northern Italy is famous for having the best builders. And I don't want to get this wrong, I might get it wrong, but that in Aldo Rossi's time, he would not specify one window, and the builders would throw a stone at the wall to decide where the window would go, to introduce chance, right, in a highly, highly articulated scheme. And that this might have had a kind of medieval provenance. It's kind of apocryphal that this would have been a kind of, and of course, if you accumulate those stone throw windows, what you get is technically, and from a anthropological and cognitive sense, technically much more provocative. I mean, to pivot quickly, if you look at the anthropological literature on memory devices and the imagination, they're almost always chimerical devices or hybrid creatures. So meaning devices that one uses in oral history traditions to quickly recall 20 generations of stories, which are fundamental, in a time of drought. Where's the well? Those objects often incorporate hybrid or chimerical or unfinished qualities because they, at a cognitive level, induce the imagination to relate to the object and have to make sense of it. And in making sense of it imaginatively, they reconstitute a memory much more effectively, right? And so it's that chimerical quality that can only come from forms of accidental encounter with highly intentional projects that make a building have that mnemotechnical or imaginative capacity, which is political, right? Which how the hell did they make this thing? You think when you walk around Venice, and then that, what kind of political situation might allow for that? You know, Venice is a kit of parts, the whole thing. Someone broke a window recently, and when I was staying in Venice, and they called the window person, they came within an hour because all the windows are the same. And they just had the standard glass for the standard window. And yet it's such a complex and varied and infinitely, fractally varied and kind of receding horizon of interest that you can look at this or that, and the amount of information and detail and in a building and a neighborhood is the same, and it kind of just totally overwhelming, and yet it's just sort of standard kit of parts, and it's precisely that chimerical quality of within a very limited palette of instruments creating so much. So I think that has to do with the thickness. To go back to your original question, is like if there's no, you know, I don't want to sound traditional. I don't hate CAD, and like, I think line drawing is good. I think also relationship to the hand is important, but like how does one reintroduce the things are physical in the process of imagining that thing.
Yeah, just looking there behind you, Rome, drawn by Lanciani, Forma Orbis Romane, and thinking about the Colosseum, which at some point in history became a quarry, a marble quarry for Rome, and so much of, there's a small section in the Colosseum of remaining marble seating, but the rest of that marble is in other buildings, in other Roman buildings. It's a slightly different principle, but it's very much in the spirit of that kind of adjustment and
precisely. And first of all, like conservation and reuse is the default, right? And not only that, mapping that is instrumental in its preservation, right? So 1901 Lanciani map was an archaeological survey. It wasn't just like a representation. It was the archaeological survey that, you know, despite Mussolini's obscene interventions, limited him, right? Because you had some grounds for resisting, saying, well, there's something here that matters. But what it ultimately shows is that that accident happens obviously over time when the default is reuse. Like, and this is where you get that scansion of history, like temporal scansion that comes with the accidents accumulated are not just cool and beautiful and romantic and authentic. You know, TikTok. They're I would argue anthropologically, mnemotechnical devices and political imagination devices that render a sense of potential, of the unknown political potential or unknown cultural potential, that root that in the past, right? So that betray the idiotic co-optation of tradition for the purpose of reactionary thinking. That the tradition is obviously the condition for imagination of something new, right? Not just a return in nostalgia and kitsch. And
another great example of a reaction, imaginary, institutional building or rethinking is 1847, where a couple of students founded the AA because they were reacting to the way that they were learning in practice. And this idea of practice and education and their kind of difficult relationship. I mean, there's something so powerful that this place has in its DNA, which is to do with how that relationship is negotiated.
So this brings it all together. I mean, it is the place that I think I came here because of this reason. Like, I had tenure and I have a wonderful job now, but I don't have tenure. My job is conditional. It's conditional on the fact that, you know, it's a democratic institution. I could be voted out. It's a pass-fail institution. It's an associational model that is reputational in its validation of quality, and in the moment of assessment defines the good for the future because of its pass-fail system, because of its democratic constitution. The legitimacy to mentor and to be mentored shifts in ways that are much more akin to a guild, right? Where the social value of one's status and maybe the political influence of one's voice come from their ability to produce well, not to consume well, and to be understood through their capacity for good production. And the unit system cultivates a kind of garden of plural goods, of many good flowers, but they're not mutually exclusive, right? So that flower is nice, that flower is nice. I don't have to pick, right? Or I hate that flower, but I recognize that it's really, really, really incredible. And so to me, it's an extent, but it's a living example that a democratic associational model can also can produce the best work, that a political experiment can lead to the highest cultural expression, that culture as art and culture as ideology and the common sense and values can be corresponded, or that actually in that correspondence it produces, that each produces the other. I think it's a chimerical building in its just physical composition of spaces. And so it's always somehow a memory device of who's been here before, and also an instigator of the imagination at once. It's legible as a house from the outside, but then immediately expands to this kind of tati section that I still get lost in, where the bar and the terrace, the space of conviviality, of intersubjectivity, is where people affirm their distinction. And that distinction is affirmed not through a number, but through a reputational criteria, where it feels like when we talk about students, it's like we're talking about the young footballers in the youth of Barcelona and where they'll play eventually, not some consumer or children, right? Or a client, but people are understood. And similarly, teachers are not just teachers. Teachers are talent that are represented by the institution.
And teachers are also students. I mean, so often do I feel like a student here.
So everyone is doing it. And I'd really like to, I believe that is the culture of history and theory here, and I'd like to make that more the culture, that history and theory teaching is not just teaching, it's laboratories for building imaginative ideas, where the seriousness of an idea, the rigor of an idea, and its imaginative reach are intrinsic to each other, and where one teaches as a laboratory with mentees to build new intellectual positions, which always have to be grounded in a kind of empirical basis, and where history and theory is not in competition with design in any way. I mean, we have this kind of inheriting this long legacy of critique, punishing speculation and design, which is stupid, right? I think that one can be constructively critical as a cleaning exercise to tidy the room for imaginative, for imaginative proposition, and that if as Mark says, when defining the critical position, scholars have always understood the world. The point is to change it. To be authentically critical is to empower the propositional. Otherwise, you're just being self-righteous and moralizing. But furthermore, it works even more the other way around. And this is, I think, Vishian, which is that history and theory needs the speculative act to help shed the light on what to understand rigorously and empirically, right? So I get ideas for what to research from spending time with makers and students here, right? It is a source.
Yeah, it's fundamental.
It's fundamental to leave the kind of imminent frame of what we can understand, and to sort of exceed it, right? It's the moment. It's the act of intuition which leads to new forms of conceptualization.
Well, isn't it interesting that so often AA is seen as this theoretical place, but actually theory is only useful as it's applied in practice, really. So I so often have to say that actually practice is in the DNA of this place, because it was invented to actually transform practice through education. and that relationship, it's actually being tested even through history and theory in relationship to design, as you.
I mean, we try to trying to implement this in our classrooms and as well as in our framing in the school, but like praxis in the truest sense as a continuum between practice and theory, not as just something people say. I mean, yes, like where the means are the ends, it's the prefigurative position is where practice and theory come together. But I mean it really in the kind of Gramscian sense, which is the only way in which one can have transcendent relationship to the common sense and actually understand the world from an organically and authentically different position in order to push it forward is through the maker's knowledge, is through the act of doing. Doing is only through doing and the shaping of the kind of cultivation of intuition around through doing, quite literally, like in a really banal way, like embodiment leads thinking, and then the thinking frames the new conditions for different forms of like embodied action. Like you can't have one without the other. Seriousness and imagination come together. I mean, there's an intrinsic joy to knowledge, to the production of knowledge. I am like a fetishist of like intellectual order. Like I love logic and coherence. I believe that coherence is will save us, right? I think whenever there's so much brutality and violence in the world today, it's very clear that it's incoherent or that it's illogic.
Yeah.
Right? That it's reverse causality. That it's not I'm wet because it's raining, but it's raining because I'm wet. Manipulations of perception and truth. So I think that there's introducing coherence is fundamental, and reconstructing coherence is fundamental. But critique itself can escape the anchor of coherence so often and just become pontification and performances of intelligence. And the only way to ground it back to its meaning, whether it be adding intellectual coherence or nurturing the soil, fertilizing the soil for provocation and proposal, is if it retains, if theory retains its link to practice, right? Like if theory is grounded in coherence, and incoherence means its relationship to practice, right? So the intellectual virtue of coherence and logic, seriousness, practicing what you preach, can only be guarded in relationship to doing and to practice.
But also the object that has gone through that process, or the object that emerges from that kind of higher degree of connection between theory and practice, it's so much more effective in society.
Yeah. I mean, I think that illogic is very effective. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are now. So I have this watch, which I just got as a reminder of this. So this is inspired by the writings of Wu Ming, formerly Luther Blissett, and the writings on Q.
It's very Aldo Rossi, that
so
watch.
This watch is Hans Hollein.
Okay.
Postmodern, kind of hyper Trump, right?
Yeah.
And I wear it as a reminder that from Wu Ming, the anarchist writer collective from Bologna, who wrote a book called Q about the Protestant Reformations and conspiracies and counter-conspiracies, which then became the inspiration for the QAnon movement, who in a wonderful podcast by some friends who interviewed him, interviewed Wu Ming 1, I think, argues that you can't fight illogic with logic. You can't try to banish the enchantment of mythical thinking, especially salacious, solipsistic mythical thinking, with reason. You only fuel the fire. So you have to double down on logic. One has to flirt with that illogic and then reveal the trick to take the whole apparatus down with it, right? So one defeats stupidity by flirting with stupidity, by attaching almost an ironic exaggeration of stupidity to stupidity, and then one reveals the manufacturer, and then the whole thing comes down. Okay, so you have to fight cancer with chemo, right? And then you can introduce the healthy stuff. This is how booming. I mean, there are examples in the 90s. There was a moral panic in Italy around Goths. And on the news, it got on the news that Goths were somehow sacrificing children in the forest. Some totally fabricated news bit. And they were friends with Goths in Bologna because they're kind of anarchist punks, and they didn't like that their Goth friends were being maligned. So they decided, well, how do we beat this? They went kind of viral, right? The logic went viral. So they invented a counter conspiracy and fed it into the news that there were some youth subcultures that identified as angels that were going to the forest to have epic like battles with the satanic Goths. And that entered the news, and it entered on all the TV in Italy that there were these kind of angels fighting these demons in the forest. And then they revealed the trick, that they made it up, and the whole bullshit manufacture of the logic kind of collapsed. And then one writes the book with coherence in the space that's left, right? And one tries to slowly reconstruct through coherence and logic, and which is ultimately indistinguishable from respect and empathy and humanity. It can't be separated.
I like that there is still space for tarot, and astrology and magic in what you paint as a kind of
well, I mean,
hopeful.
There is ish. I mean, like, look, I think we live. So Max Weber's famous thesis about the crisis of modernity is the death of enchantment, right? So he argued in the early 20th century that modernity is best understood as the crisis of enchantment. And I think a lot of really good thinking since then, especially recently, has understood enchantment as the kind of default operative mechanism of like sort of late liberal, late capitalist modernity, which is to say, the whole stock market and futures trading is indistinguishable from tarot card reading to a sense, but with kind of economics and financial modeling, presenting the illusion of certainty, which allows people to forecast and instantiate future prices in the present, which then somehow become true, right? So it's a kind of wizardry of engineering social facts. And, this is the kind of Bitcoin is the same as tarot card. I mean, I think that the interest in these things speak to more authentic needs to relate to the default enchantment of capital that and political manufacture that's the ultimate means of production, of political production right now. And so people have to identify with it somehow rather than being told that it's just science, right? That it's kind of objective, that we're being led by objective processes rather than the apparatus of the appearance of economics, of kind of science. So people identify with things like tarot and Bitcoin as a kind of sort of equivalence, I think. I'm for a much more open embracing of enchantment through architecture, right? So like whatever happened to beauty being a source of enchantment, right? And not some kind of label. And how do we redefine beauty to not just mean a two-dimensional experience of an image or of an Instagram post, but how do we align beauty with the forms of enchantment which enable the imagination, right? So the word beauty is up for grabs, right? This is like the ultimate taboo word in architecture. We're not allowed to use it. But of course, if you ask anyone in the world, why do you like architecture? Good architecture, because it's beautiful. So we have to make sense of that. And I think people don't really know what the word beautiful means anymore. And I think we can kind of decide to an extent.
Does it mean something to you?
So I think I would like to define it instrumentally to orient production in the service of the good, the aesthetic good and the social and economic and political good, which I think should be aligned. So, I mean, I think if one is to be medieval about it and then follow the intellectual tradition that comes out of that well into the 20th century, the philosophical tradition that comes out of that, one could define beauty as that which is made with love, right? And that sort of isolates nature I mean, one could define Gaia as love or whatever, but I don't want to get into that domain. But if in terms of human-made things that obtain the status of beautiful, I mean, it's pretty hard to think of an example of something that's human-made that's beautiful, that wasn't made broadly with an idea that we could gloss as love. Whether that's a condition of possibility, and again, going back to food in the supply chain and the sourcing of the materials and how they come to exist, or in the assembly, or whether one defines just simply practice, like repetition and practice and commitment as love, as a form of love, right? Of getting good at something.
But it touches on the divine. It touches on the, theology.
Yeah, I don't want to go there. I don't think it needs to.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't need to. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't need to be mystical. It's very, to me, I'm an anthropologist. I mean, it's like powerful objects exist through the whole human repertoire, and they exist for a reason. And one can be quite methodical about understanding why those objects are ascribed ritual and ascribed meaning, why they abduce action, seemingly in and of themselves, why they seem to acquire a kind of agency in their ability to motivate human decisions, to shift, and ultimately maybe shift some forms of cultural norms. And that exists in their imaginative capacity to really to abduce interest, right? So this is going back to the accident, to the unfinished, to the hybrid and chimerical. They're all, they're kind of modes of, but there's the intrinsic skill. And one could add to that the experience of witnessing skill, which is just a proxy for, or kind of placeholder for everything that goes into acquiring that skill, which might as well be called love. I mean, and probably intergenerationally, or at least, or even, and certainly communally, because of all the people around that individual or collective that allow them to have the time to acquire that, right? All the care that enabled it.
Care, commitment.
Care, commitment. So David Graeber's, one of my heroes, one of the sort of unfinished projects was that he wanted to replace, as a kind of constitutive value of society, production, consumption with care and freedom. That care is always the condition for people's freedom. So care could be defined as the maintaining and nourishing of people's capacity for freedom. Very simply, a parent looking after their child allows them the safety and the freedom and the agency to form themselves, right? But equally, freedom is the kind of reward of care, right? And this kind of, and he never really finishes it before he tragically died, so sadly died around late COVID. But I think that the word beauty exists in that continuum to be useful, not as this kind of universal law, but I think we can decide that when it comes to making, and that it's not too distant from what people are approximating when they're reaching for a word, that a piece of food or art or architecture or whatever in between or beyond is good because it is a reflection of both of the freedom of expression nurtured through the care that allowed for that. And by freedom, I mean the ability to transcend or exceed expectation, and that when one witnesses an object made within that continuum, inevitably abduces interest and interpretation and imagination and memory, right? And that what kills that is the little text on the wall that tells you what to think, which is what some people might think history and theory is in the business of doing, which I'd like to banish, right? It's like,
it's sad that some artists
telling you to think that.
It's sad that some artists even write the text themselves. The Cornelia Parker exhibition at the Tate Britain, she wrote all the guidelines for the viewer how to read the.
Yeah, I mean, it betrays one's own capacity as an artist, I think, which is, I think, by definition, I mean, we are limited by as humans, we're constantly battling being trapped inside of ourselves, and the only thing we have is words to try for a moment to exceed our interiority, right? And yet we're deeply relational and intersubjective beings who probably exist in forms of distributed cognition. I mean, one could not imagine a person existing outside of other people, is that still a person? In a kind of philosophical experiment. And so art gives us the experience of the distributed cognition before or after or beyond language, because of its abductive power to generate forms of meaning and understanding that are instantly relatable before,
and it's perhaps something
vocalization for speaking.
And it's probably one thing the large language models can never emulate.
Absolutely not. That's the stupidity of the model. It's the world's smartest idiot. It's always going to be the world's smartest idiot because it will never be transcendent, because it never can shift between intuition and concept. As far as I think, I might be proven wrong. This is going to be on the internet. But, but that's my feeling.